Sheila Paylan is an international human rights lawyer and former legal advisor at the United Nations for over 15 years. She is currently a senior fellow in international law at APRI, a think tank based in Yerevan. Recently, Ms. Paylan penned an article for Opinio Juris entitled When Might is Wrong, addressing Azerbaijan's refusal to comply with the ICJ's order to unblock the Lachin corridor. So, Ms. Paylan, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So to start off, I want to concentrate on this ICJ order and the reactions to it. On February 22nd, the ICJ issued an order for Azerbaijan to take all measures at its disposal to reopen the Lachin corridor. Azerbaijan's countermeasure 2 regarding landmines was also rejected. The corridor has been blocked now for over 100 days. When the order came out, what did you think of the reactions coming from Azerbaijan, from Azerbaijani officials? Did you find anything particularly interesting or surprising?
Not surprising, because the result was pretty much a near total win for Armenia and a near total loss, well, a total loss for Azerbaijan. So we often see Azerbaijan spinning in their favor, interpreting things in their favor. So I wasn't entirely surprised, but it was sort of the level of misconstrual and the level of misrepresentation that surprised me, and it kind of went hand in hand with the level of quality, which was quite low, of their arguments in the hearings preceding the ruling. I mean, I think I was actually more surprised with how they were towing their party line of like, there's no blockade and there's nothing we can do about the protesters, and there were more sophisticated arguments that could have been made during the hearings. And they have really good lawyers, you know, they have an all-star legal team. So I don't think that their lawyers were, and I'm speculating, but I don't think that their lawyers necessarily advised to go down that path, because it was so clearly, how do I say, like, not strong.
Right.
So when the rulings came out, of course, you know, right away they focused on Armenia's losses and none of the operative parts of the order. And it still does surprise me at some point when I see such blatant misconstrual, like the Minister of Foreign Affairs sent a letter to the Secretary General 5 days after the ruling, laying out Azerbaijan's interpretation of the order, which just goes completely against the wording of the order and also basic rules of interpretation. So yeah, sometimes I wonder, do they actually believe this, you know, or do they actually believe that anyone's going to buy this? Because it's like black on white. Right. It says this. You can't interpret it. Well, I guess you can, but you know.
Well, they didn't even, like you mentioned, they didn't really talk about the operative parts of the rulings.
Yeah, just ignoring it, like it wasn't, as if it wasn't there.
It was almost more like spin than it was a reaction. The ICJ's rejection of Measure 1 and Measure 3 was also interesting, and you mentioned this, I believe, in your piece in Opinio Juris. So, as I understood, the ICJ said that there wasn't sufficient evidence to talk about the gas and electricity supplies being blocked to Nagorno-Karabakh, and the orchestration of the eco-activist protest. So, I mean, like I said, it's almost seemingly like that they have a team of spin doctors. It's about spinning it, like not mentioning, for example, the operative measures. I mean, did you see any other examples of that?
Well, you know, Measure 1 wasn't actually flat out rejected. It was more, in my analysis, sort of subsumed. So Armenia asked the court to order 3 things. 1, to stop the orchestration or support of the protesters. 2, to unblock the corridor, basically. And 3, the gas and the utilities. The court amended Measure 2. So they didn't grant it exactly the way Armenia asked for it. They amended it to say, orders Azerbaijan to take all measures at its disposal, you know, etc. So having granted that, why would they need to grant Measure 1? it's one of many measures, to do something about the protesters is one of many measures at Azerbaijan's disposal. And that's actually pretty normal. Like courts, especially international courts, won't usually get too specific on how to order a state to do something. It's sort of almost disrespectful. Like the state has agreed to be bound by certain rules. And so by saying, look, you violated the rule, take all measures to comply with the rule, a state should in good faith be able to understand what that means. But in this case, obviously, it had the adverse effect. I mean, they spin everything, and it's not that surprising. Obviously, this loss was so colossal that it doesn't look good. But other examples, I mean, the last time, this was the third request for provisional measures from Armenia, by Armenia. The last time was right after the September 2022 invasion, when more Armenian captives were taken. And Armenia requested a modification of the first provisional measure orders that were given to apply to the POWs from back in the day from 2020. And the court didn't see it necessary to grant that. What that meant was that the new captives are already included in the previous order, so there's no need to modify. Azerbaijan went, oh, see, they got rejected, and there's, obviously Armenia has no leg to stand on. So that was an interesting spin, but of course the language of the court lent itself to it on some level. But it's obvious to people who, value human rights what they meant. Obviously, don't hurt POWs is a normal, it's encapsulated. Yeah.
Many people in Armenia were lauding the efforts of the Armenian legal teams as well. I also want to get your reaction to what you think about the performance of all the various, people that were involved in all of this. You mentioned that the Azerbaijan also had their own lawyers, which many were, top-class lawyers, but they didn't get the outcome it seemed that they were after. The other thing is more, I want to ask about technicalities. I mean, as I understood, if an ICJ order is not complied with, then technically the United Nations Security Council can be involved. I mean, can you explain a bit what we're talking about here when people mention the United Nations Security Council, and is that really a possibility? I mean, how does that work exactly?
That's a huge
question,
but I'll try to answer it succinctly in the context of this. The ICJ is a UN court. It's the top court of the world, and it's established by the United Nations. So it's linked to the Security Council in that, the Security Council, among other functions it has, is meant to enable the respect for orders that come out of the ICJ. Not orders, judgments. Sorry, let me rephrase that because the wording is really important. Orders, interim orders, provisional measures orders, long story short, aren't something that I think a party that has okay, let me rephrase this. Armenia can't necessarily right now go to the Security Council to say, hey, there's this provisional measures order that Azerbaijan is not respecting, because the judgment, the overall case is not finished. So there's still time for the ICJ to sort of repair the wrong of non-compliance. At the end of the case, when the judgment comes out, then Armenia could go, if Azerbaijan doesn't comply with the final judgment, if it ends up being in Armenia's favor. In the meantime, the Security Council can do whatever it wants. And if Azerbaijan's non-compliance with the ICJ order is a threat to international peace and security, then the UN Security Council has a duty to intervene and force somehow or compel somehow Azerbaijan to comply. So they can do it. It just can't come from Armenia's initiative necessarily. And whether they're going to do it or not is, it's not a legal determination. They can and should do it. Will they,
I see. I want to also ask, I mean, I found it pretty interesting. I want to go back a bit to the examples of spin. The Azerbaijani ambassador to Germany, Nasimi Aghayev, was tweeting over the weekend condemning police brutality in France during the anti-pension protests. There's this narrative shifting that's going on when they were reacting. And obviously people were talking about the ICJ order in that context. So my question is that narrative shifting effective? I mean, are they just doing it because they have to do it? Do you believe that these international courts are cognitive of this? Are they watching this? Are they aware of this?
Of course they're watching. I mean, they should be watching. But, you know, the spin that Azerbaijan put on the ICJ order, I think, was much more for its own people than it was. You know, of course, it's also a little bit grandstanding before the international community, but where it's most effective is vis-a-vis its own population to make it, because they don't necessarily understand how it works. But in front of the international community, and especially in the eyes of the ICJ, before whom there are still 2 pending cases, no, I don't think it's effective at all, because it's actually quite dishonest. And I mean, I don't want to go too far, but depending on how you look at it, if you really don't comply with the court's orders, that can amount to contempt. It's like contemptful of the court. There are reasonable spaces for interpretation, and then there's like the overt, flat out, that's not at all what the judgment says, right? So yeah, I thought it was comical also to see condemnation of crackdowns on protests in France. You know, this is like almost what I thought about it was that it shows how futile the whole act of condemnation is at some point. You know, it's almost a joke. You know, why the endless condemnations that are going against Azerbaijan that lead to very little at some point, in fact, are leading to this comical counter condemnation that just goes to show how kind of useless it is almost. Yeah.
I want to ask, I mentioned earlier, but I do want to get your reaction to it. The Armenian legal teams that have been involved in all of this, what impressed you about them? What did you find, laudable?
Everything. I mean, I think just the fact that Armenia is doing this is the best. It's the best. It's like a dream come true.
Do you think they should have started doing all these sorts of things earlier? I mean, in terms of
definitely.
Since independence.
Definitely, but I wasn't here before, and I don't know what the climate was like. So I'm just glad it's happening. I'd like to see more women. I'd like to see more inclusion and diversity on that. But the quality of the arguments they speak for themselves, and that's not to say that Azerbaijan's legal team was not good, but their arguments weren't good.
Right.
And those lawyers are bound by the instructions of their clients. So, there's only so much that you can advise your client, and then at some point it's up to them to decide what's going to be, if they're okay with what's going to be said or not. So, I think that I only have praise for Armenia's legal team and efforts.
Okay, and finally, I want to get your reaction to the news which has swept the world that the ICJ, after this order, put out an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin.
The ICC.
ICC, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, that's okay, easy to confuse.
The International Criminal Court put out an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin for the deportation of Ukrainian children, I believe, during the invasion of Ukraine. The Armenian Constitutional Court also ruled that Armenia ratifying the Rome Statute and becoming a full member of the ICC would not be contrary to the Armenian constitution. Now, reactions have been pouring in about what this means, whether this is good, whether this is bad, what this would mean for Armenia's relations with Russia. So what did you think? What was your reaction when you saw these two developments in quite a short space of time happen?
I have a long career preceding my arrival to Armenia in international criminal courts, and I really believe in the international criminal justice system and the need for international criminal accountability as a form of deterrence for future war crimes. Like, it's what I believe, and I'm not the only one. It's very important. So I was very happy to see finally Armenia's desire to move forward with Rome Statute ratification. And at the same time, when the Putin arrest warrant came out, my old Sheila, was like, wow, that's amazing. Nobody could ever have thought something like that would have happened. Like the world is shifting. It's almost unthinkable. So we're getting closer and closer to letting people who think they're untouchable that they're not untouchable. We're getting there. But the timing is so unfortunate for Armenia, because I can see how it's a bit of a wrench in the process. And I have my own opinion about it, which is I think that we should proceed. I don't think this isn't really fundamentally Armenia's problem, but it is a problem. I get why there's a debate, and some thoughts have to go into it, but I think it would be really, really valuable for Armenia to be able to join the club of the international community, most of which is part of this, ICC club, because then we can actually maybe do something about POWs and civilians who get,
because the purpose was not originally to arrest Putin. It was that if Azerbaijani forces commit war crimes within Armenian territory. This has nothing to do with Putin. Yeah, it was unfortunate timing.
Yeah, and he has immunity. It's not obvious whether or not Armenia has to arrest him if he comes to Armenia. I think that there's a good case to argue that they wouldn't have to necessarily. I mean, the law is not clear on that yet, but. Anyways, I'm overstepping now. That's a different interview.
Okay, well, please come again one day. Sheila Paylan, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us on CivilNet.